My name is Emily Carter, and I'm 29 years old, and 3 weeks ago my mother sent me an invoice for $186,000 with the subject line, Reimbursement for Raising a Failure. No explanation, no apology, just a neatly formatted PDF with line items like food, clothing, school supplies, and a final total that she expected me to pay within 30 days. At the bottom, she added a note that said, "Since you've clearly decided not to become the daughter we invested in, it's only fair that you reimburse us for the cost of raising you." I stared at that number for a long time in my tiny one-bedroom apartment in Columbus, Ohio, the kind of apartment where the refrigerator hums a little too loudly and the heating vents click every few minutes like they're reminding you the building is older than your parents. $186,000. According to my mother, that was the price of raising me into what she called a disappointment. And if that had been the end of the story, I probably would have deleted the email, blocked her number, and spent the rest of my life trying not to think about it. But what my mother didn't know when she sent that invoice was that someone else in our family had been watching everything for years. Someone quiet, someone patient, someone who believed that if you're going to put a price on a person, you'd better be ready for someone else to calculate the cost of your behavior. Because the very next afternoon, a thick cream-colored envelope arrived at my door from my grandmother, Margaret Carter. And inside that envelope was a document that would force my entire family to sit in complete silence for 14 seconds at our next gathering. 14 seconds that felt like an eternity. 14 seconds where my mother realized the cost of calling your own daughter a failure might be a lot higher than $186,000. But before I tell you what my grandmother sent and why it changed everything, take a quick second to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or treated like the least important person in your own family, consider hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. It really helps the channel grow, and it lets me know these stories matter to you. Alright, let me take you back to where all of this really started, because the invoice didn't come out of nowhere. In my family, there had always been two different sets of rules. My older brother Daniel was the kind of son parents brag about at dinner parties. Confident, outgoing, good at sports, the kind of guy who could walk into a room and somehow make everyone believe he belonged there. When Daniel turned 18, my parents surprised him with a brand new BMW 3 Series sitting in the driveway with a giant red bow on the hood. The car cost $52,000. My mother took pictures from 3 different angles while my father kept saying things like, "This is what happens when you work hard and show potential." 2 years later, when I turned 18, I got a used laptop that still had the previous owner's college stickers on it and a note taped to the keyboard that said, "You'll need this for community college." Daniel went to the University of Michigan. Tuition, housing, meal plan, everything paid for. Roughly $72,000 a year. When I got accepted to Ohio State, my father sat me down at the kitchen table and explained that the family couldn't afford 2 college educations. According to him, Daniel's degree in business was an investment, while my interest in data analysis was uncertain. I took out student loans, worked 2 part-time jobs, and graduated with a degree my parents barely acknowledged. At Thanksgiving dinners, my mother would ask Daniel about internships, networking events, and future promotions. When she got to me, the questions were shorter. "So, Emily's still working with computers?" Sometimes she'd add a little laugh like it was a hobby instead of a career. For a long time I thought if I just worked harder, if I became successful enough, maybe the balance would change. Maybe they'd look at me the same way they looked at Daniel. But families like mine don't measure worth that way. They measure worth in attention, praise, and who gets introduced first when relatives visit. And in the Carter household, there was always one star and one afterthought. The strange part is that there was one person who never treated me like an afterthought. My grandmother Margaret, though everyone called her Maggie, lived alone in a quiet brick house about 30 minutes outside the city. She'd built a small real estate portfolio over the years, and people in town respected her in that quiet way reserved for someone who has seen a lot and says very little. When I was growing up, she had a habit of watching conversations instead of joining them. At family dinners, she'd sit at the end of the table with her tea, listening to my parents praise Daniel while gently redirecting the conversation whenever it drifted too close to criticizing me. Once when I was about 16, after my mother joked that I was the quiet disappointment of the family, my grandmother leaned across the table and said something I never forgot. Sometimes the quiet ones are just the ones who are paying attention. At the time, I didn't fully understand what she meant. I just knew she was the only adult in the room who didn't laugh. Years later, I would realize that my grandmother wasn't just paying attention to the jokes or the favoritism or the small humiliations that built up over time. She was paying attention to patterns. Patterns in how my parents treated their children, patterns in how success was measured, patterns in what people said when they thought nobody important was listening. And those patterns were the reason that when my mother finally decided to send me a bill for being born into the wrong role in our family story, my grandmother already had something prepared. Something official. Something written in language that didn't leave much room for interpretation. But before that document arrived, before the envelope, before the 14 seconds of silence that would change the way my parents looked at me forever, there was the moment my mother decided to put a price tag on my existence. And that moment happened 2 weeks earlier at our annual Carter family reunion, when my mother stood in the middle of a backyard full of relatives and said the sentence that set everything in motion. The Carter family reunion happened every June in my Aunt Melissa's backyard outside Dayton, Ohio, and if you had driven past the house that afternoon, you would have thought it looked like any other American family gathering. There were folding chairs spread across the grass, 2 long plastic tables covered with aluminum trays of food, a portable speaker playing classic rock from the 1980s, and at least 40 relatives moving in small circles of conversation. The smell of grilled hamburgers drifted across the yard while children ran between the trees with plastic cups of lemonade. On the surface, it looked warm and ordinary, the kind of summer afternoon people post on social media with captions about family traditions. But if you had stayed long enough and listened carefully, you would have noticed something else. In our family, conversations had gravity. They always bent toward one person. My brother Daniel stood near the grill, wearing a navy blue polo shirt with the logo of his company stitched above the pocket. At 27 years old, he had already been promoted twice at a financial consulting firm in Chicago, and every relative who approached him seemed to ask the same question. How is work going? Are you traveling for clients? When do you think you will make partner? Daniel answered each question with the relaxed confidence of someone who had practiced success for years. My father stood beside him like a proud narrator, occasionally adding details that Daniel forgot to mention. Daniel closed a $3 million deal last quarter. Daniel is mentoring 2 junior analysts. Daniel might be relocating to New York next year. Each sentence landed like another brick in the statue my parents had been building of him since childhood. I stood about 20 feet away holding a paper plate with potato salad and a hamburger that had already gone cold. At reunions, my role had always been quieter. Some relatives asked polite questions about my job as a data analyst in Columbus. Others nodded politely and moved on to talk with Daniel again. It was not cruel exactly. It was simply the natural order of the Carter family universe. Around 3:30 in the afternoon, my mother gathered everyone closer to the patio. She had that familiar smile she used when she was about to make an announcement. A few people assumed it might be about Daniel. Perhaps a promotion or an engagement or some new achievement worth celebrating. My mother raised a plastic cup of iced tea and tapped it lightly against the railing. Everyone turned toward her. Well, she said, I just want to say how proud we all are of Daniel. Several people clapped immediately. My father nodded like he had expected the applause. Daniel smiled and shrugged modestly, the way he always did when compliments arrived exactly on schedule. My mother continued speaking, listing Daniel's accomplishments in a tone that sounded almost ceremonial. Then, after a short pause, she glanced in my direction. "And, of course, we also have Emily," she added. The shift in her voice was subtle, but unmistakable. Emily has always taken a different path. A few relatives looked at me politely. One of my cousins offered a small, encouraging smile. My mother continued, still holding her cup like a microphone. "Every family has one child who soars, and one who, well, takes a little longer to figure things out." A couple of people laughed quietly, unsure whether the comment was meant as a joke. My mother did not laugh. She looked directly at me and said the sentence that seemed harmless to some people in the yard but echoed in my mind for days afterward. "Emily never really amounted to what we expected, but that is life. Sometimes investments just do not work out the way you planned." The word investments hung in the air like a loose thread nobody wanted to pull. My father shifted his weight slightly, but said nothing. Daniel looked down at the grass as if examining something interesting near his shoes. I felt the familiar instinct to smile politely and pretend the moment had not landed the way it did. That had always been my role. The quiet daughter. The agreeable one. The one who absorbed uncomfortable moments so the rest of the family could return to their conversations without disruption. A few seconds later, someone changed the subject to dessert, and the gathering continued as if nothing unusual had happened. But my grandmother Maggie had been sitting in a wicker chair near the edge of the patio the entire time. She had not laughed. She had not spoken. She simply watched my mother the way a chess player studies the board after an opponent makes a careless move. Later that evening, as the sun lowered behind the trees and people began packing up folding chairs, my grandmother called my name softly. "Emily, come sit with me for a minute." I pulled another chair beside her. She poured 2 glasses of iced tea from a pitcher on the table and handed one to me. For a few seconds, we watched the yard quietly while the last relatives gathered their things. Finally, she said something that at the time felt almost casual. "Your mother has always believed life works like an investment portfolio." I looked at her, unsure what she meant. She took a slow sip of tea and continued. "Some assets are praised. Others are written off. But sometimes the market surprises people who think they understand value." I asked her what she meant by that, but she only smiled and changed the subject to the long drive I would have back to Columbus. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning at exactly 9:14, an email appeared in my inbox with the subject line "Reimbursement Statement." The sender was my mother, and attached to that email was the document that would prove my grandmother had been paying much closer attention to our family than anyone realized. The email arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning while I was sitting at my desk on the 7th floor of a modest office building in downtown Columbus. My job as a data analyst was not glamorous, but it was steady, and I had grown to appreciate the calm rhythm of it. Rows of numbers, patterns hidden inside spreadsheets, small discoveries that only appeared when you looked long enough. My computer clock read 9:14 in the morning when the notification appeared in the corner of the screen. The subject line read "Reimbursement Statement." The sender was my mother, Linda Carter. At first I assumed it was some kind of mistake, perhaps a forwarded document or a family expense someone meant to send to my father. I clicked the message and saw a single sentence. "Please review the attached invoice and arrange repayment within 30 days. Beneath the sentence was a PDF attachment titled Parental Cost Summary. I opened the file expecting confusion. What I saw instead was a carefully formatted document that looked like it had been created using professional accounting software. At the top of the page was my full name, Emily Carter. Beneath it was a table with columns labeled category, description, and total amount. The first entry read childcare and early development expenses, $23,400. The next line read food and household provisions ages 0 to 18. 41.
Tous en dollars.
Clothing and school supplies. $14,800. Health insurance contributions. $17,200. Extracurricular activities and general upbringing costs. $39,000. The numbers continued down the page in neat rows until they reached the final line near the bottom. Total investment in Emily Carter. $186,000. Underneath that number was a paragraph written in my mother's voice, though the language sounded oddly formal. Since you have chosen a lifestyle that does not reflect the expectations or standards we invested in during your upbringing, we believe it is reasonable for you to reimburse us for the financial cost associated with raising you. Payment in full is expected within 30 days. Partial payment arrangements may be discussed upon request. I stared at the screen long enough that the numbers began to blur slightly. For a moment I wondered if it was some kind of elaborate joke. But my mother had never been the joking type, especially about money or reputation. The document continued with smaller details that made the situation feel even stranger. A payment schedule suggestion divided the amount into monthly installments of $3,100 over 5 years. At the bottom of the page was a note in bold text. Failure to respond may result in legal consultation regarding recovery of parental investment costs. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the office. 2 coworkers were discussing weekend plans near the coffee machine. Someone else was typing quickly on a keyboard across the room. The world outside my computer screen seemed perfectly normal, but the document in front of me felt like something from a parallel universe where parents sent invoices to their children for existing. My first instinct was not anger. It was a strange, quiet disbelief. I opened the email again and reread the sentence my mother had written above the attachment. Please review the attached invoice. The word invoice carried the same tone she had used at the reunion when she spoke about investments that did not work out. I closed the file and sat there for several minutes without moving. Around 9:30 my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. I saw you probably got Mom's email. Do not overreact. She's just trying to make a point. The message felt almost rehearsed. I imagined the conversation that must have happened in my parents' kitchen before the email was sent. My mother explaining the idea while my father nodded quietly and Daniel offered calm advice about presentation and wording. I typed a reply that simply said I received it. Daniel responded a minute later. Mom says if you call tonight we can talk about a payment plan. The phrase payment plan made the situation feel even more surreal. It sounded like a conversation between a bank and a borrower rather than a family. I put my phone down and opened the PDF one more time, studying the numbers like they were data points in a spreadsheet. That was something my job had trained me to do well. When people think in numbers, they often reveal more than they intend. My mother had calculated the cost of raising me as if I were an expense line in a household budget. But what she had not considered was that every calculation invites another one. Around 11:15, the office mail cart rolled past the rows of desks. The receptionist handed me a thick cream-colored envelope with my name written across the front in careful blue ink. The return address read Margaret Carter. My grandmother rarely sent physical mail. She preferred phone calls or short handwritten notes during holidays. The weight of the envelope felt heavier than a simple letter. Inside was a folded document printed on heavy paper and a short note written in the same steady handwriting I remembered from birthday cards. Emily, sometimes people only understand numbers when they appear on official paper. You may want to read the enclosed document carefully before you respond to your mother. I unfolded the document slowly. At the top of the page were the words Estate Amendment Declaration followed by the name Margaret Elaine Carter. The language that followed was precise, formal, and unmistakably legal. And as I continued reading the paragraphs, I realized my grandmother had been preparing for this moment long before my mother ever decided to send an invoice. The document my grandmother sent was 3 pages long, printed on thick cream-colored paper with the kind of formal layout you normally see in legal offices rather than family mail. At the top of the first page was her full name written in bold letters, Margaret Elaine Carter, followed by the title estate amendment and conditional inheritance clause. I remember reading the first paragraph twice before the meaning fully settled in my mind, because the language was precise and deliberate in a way that left very little room for interpretation. It stated that my grandmother had recently reviewed the distribution terms of her estate, which included several rental properties in Dayton, a small commercial building she had purchased in 1998, and multiple investment accounts she had quietly built over the past 30 years. The document explained that the total estimated value of these assets currently exceeded $3.2 million. I had never asked about my grandmother's finances, and she had never spoken about them openly, so seeing the number written on the page felt almost unreal. But the next section of the document explained why she had decided to update the terms of her will. According to the language in the amendment, she had observed a pattern of behavior within the Carter family that concerned her deeply. The text did not mention my parents by name in the opening paragraphs, but the description was unmistakable. It referred to any direct heir who attempted to assign financial liability to a child for the cost of their upbringing, or who publicly classified a child as a failed investment. In those circumstances, the document stated that heir would immediately forfeit their inheritance rights from Margaret Carter's estate. I felt my chest tighten slightly as the implications became clear. My grandmother had not written the amendment as a vague philosophical statement. She had written it as a specific legal condition tied directly to the behavior my mother had displayed at the reunion, and then formalized through the invoice she sent 2 weeks later. The document continued by identifying the primary heirs under the estate. My father, Robert Carter, and my mother, Linda Carter, were both listed as beneficiaries under the original structure of the will. However, the amendment introduced a conditional clause that altered their eligibility if certain actions were taken against any of their children. The wording was careful and unmistakably legal. If a parent within the Carter family attempted to pursue reimbursement, repayment, or financial compensation from their own child for the act of raising that child, the parent would be considered in violation of the ethical provisions outlined by Margaret Carter and therefore removed as a beneficiary from her estate. The value of the forfeited inheritance would then be redistributed among the remaining heirs according to a revised allocation schedule described later in the document. I sat at my desk reading those lines slowly while the normal sounds of the office continued around me. Someone laughed near the hallway. A printer started humming in the corner of the room, but the quiet weight of that document seemed to fill the space in front of me. My grandmother had not simply disagreed with my mother's behavior. She had prepared a legal mechanism to respond to it. The second page of the amendment listed the adjusted distribution plan in the event that a violation occurred. According to the new terms, if either of my parents were disqualified under the clause, their share of the estate would be redirected primarily to the grandchildren. Daniel and I would each receive 50% of the redistributed assets. The document did not present the change as punishment. Instead, the wording framed it as a correction of values. Margaret Carter believed that financial resources should support the people who demonstrated integrity rather than the people who treated family relationships like business transactions. I leaned back in my chair and read the final section of the document, which confirmed that the amendment had been signed in the presence of 2 witnesses and notarized by a licensed attorney in Dayton just 6 months earlier. The signatures were real. The legal seal at the bottom of the page made the entire document unmistakably official. I finally unfolded the small handwritten note my grandmother had placed on top of the papers. The message was only 2 sentences long, but it carried the calm certainty I had always associated with her voice. Emily, people who turn love into a financial transaction usually believe they hold all the leverage. They forget that someone else may already be keeping track of the real cost of their behavior. I looked at the estate amendment again and imagined a moment when my mother would realize the connection between her invoice and the clause my grandmother had written months before. If my mother continued to demand payment for raising me, she would be acknowledging exactly the kind of behavior that the amendment described. And that acknowledgement would automatically remove her from a $3.2 million inheritance. I checked the time on my computer screen. It was just after noon. Daniel had already asked me to call that evening, so we could discuss a payment plan. For the first time since opening my mother's email that morning, I understood something important. My mother believed she had sent me a document that placed me under pressure. But the envelope sitting on my desk contained a document that changed the entire balance of power in our family. And my mother had absolutely no idea it existed. The rest of that afternoon passed in a strange, quiet haze where every normal activity felt slightly disconnected from what was actually unfolding in my life. I answered emails, reviewed a data set for one of our clients, and attended a short meeting about quarterly reporting, but the cream-colored envelope from my grandmother remained in the top drawer of my desk like a quiet reminder that the situation with my parents was no longer as simple as they believed. Around 5:30, I left the office building and stepped into the warm Columbus evening. The sidewalks were busy with people heading home, the late sunlight reflecting off the windows of nearby buildings. Normally, I would have stopped for groceries or picked up dinner from the small deli near my apartment, but that night my mind kept circling back to the message Daniel had sent earlier. Call tonight so we can discuss a payment plan. The phrase still felt surreal. By the time I reached my apartment, it was just after 6:15. I placed the envelope from my grandmother on the kitchen table and opened my laptop again, rereading the estate amendment slowly from beginning to end. Each sentence reinforced the same simple reality. If my mother continued to demand repayment for raising me, she would automatically disqualify herself from inheriting a portion of my grandmother's $3.2 million estate. My grandmother had written the clause months before the reunion, which meant she had anticipated exactly the kind of behavior my mother eventually displayed. The calm precision of it all made me realize something about my grandmother that I had never fully appreciated before. She did not react emotionally to conflict. She prepared for it long before it happened. At 6:47, my phone buzzed on the table. Daniel was calling. I let it ring once before answering. His voice came through the speaker calm and slightly rehearsed, the way it sounded whenever. He was trying to mediate a situation. Emily, I am glad you picked up. Mom was worried you might ignore the email. I walked over to the window and looked down at the quiet street below. I received it this morning, I said. Daniel exhaled slowly, as if he had been waiting for confirmation. Good.
So, you understand the situation then?
Mom spent a lot of time calculating those numbers. She is not trying to be cruel. She just wants acknowledgement that raising a child requires sacrifice. The words sounded almost identical to the tone he had used in his earlier text message. I could hear faint sounds in the background of the call, the clinking of dishes and the low murmur of television audio. Daniel was probably standing in my parents' kitchen. What exactly do you want me to acknowledge, Daniel? I asked. He paused for a moment before answering. That Mom and Dad invested a lot in us growing up. And if someone chooses a path that does not reflect that investment, it is reasonable to discuss accountability. I leaned against the window frame and looked at the quiet streetlights beginning to turn on outside. Daniel always framed family issues like business negotiations, as if emotional relationships could be managed with the same language used in consulting contracts. Mom is hoping you will agree to a monthly repayment plan, he continued. Something manageable. Around $3,000 a month for 5 years. If you commit to that, she will consider the matter resolved. The number matched exactly what I had seen at the bottom of the invoice. $3,100 per month. I let the silence stretch for a moment before responding. And, if I do not agree? Daniel cleared his throat slightly. Then Mom may have to consult an attorney about recovering the costs legally. She does not want it to go that far, but she feels strongly about the principle involved. Principle. The word hung in the air between us like a misplaced puzzle piece. I imagine my mother sitting somewhere nearby listening to the conversation through the half-open kitchen door. My father probably sitting quietly at the table, saying nothing as usual. I glanced down at the cream-colored envelope still resting on the kitchen table. Daniel, I said calmly, can I ask you a question before we talk about any payment? Plans? Sure, he replied. His tone was confident, almost relieved that the conversation seemed to be moving forward. If Mom continues to demand repayment, are you certain she wants to pursue that path all the way through? Daniel laughed softly, a short, confident sound. Emily, Mom has already made up her mind. She believes it is the only way to make the situation fair. Why do you ask? I reached for the envelope and slid the estate amendment halfway out, so the notarized seal at the bottom of the page caught the light from the kitchen lamp. Because I received something in the mail today that might change how she feels about that plan. Daniel went quiet for a moment. What do you mean? He asked. I folded the document carefully and placed it back into the envelope. It was from Grandma Maggie, I said. Another pause followed, longer this time. My grandmother rarely inserted herself into family conflicts, so even Daniel sounded slightly uncertain. What did she send you? He asked. I looked again at the sealed envelope and imagined the expression on my mother's face when she eventually learned what my grandmother had written into her estate 6 months earlier. Something official, I said calmly. Something Mom might want to read before she sends another invoice. Daniel did not respond immediately after I mentioned the envelope. I could hear faint movement through the phone, the quiet sound of a chair sliding against a kitchen floor somewhere in my parents' house. Finally, he spoke again, his voice slower now. What kind of document did she send you? I walked over to the kitchen table and sat down, resting my hand lightly on the envelope. It was thicker than a normal letter, the heavy paper inside giving it the quiet weight of something official. It is an amendment to her estate, I said. Daniel went silent again. For several seconds, the only sound on the line was the distant television playing in the background. When he spoke again, his tone had changed slightly. What does that have to do with Mom asking you to repay the cost of raising you? I traced my finger along the edge of the envelope as I answered. That is exactly what the amendment talks about. Another pause followed, longer this time. I imagined Daniel glancing toward the living room where my parents were probably sitting, wondering how much of this conversation they could hear. Emily, he said carefully, Grandma has always been protective of you. But Mom and Dad's finances and Grandma's estate are two completely separate issues. I understood why he wanted to believe that. In most families they would be. But our grandmother had never approached family decisions the way most people did. She approached them the way someone manages long-term investments, quietly observing patterns until the right moment arrived to adjust the structure. Daniel, I said calmly, the amendment says that if any parent in the Carter family tries to collect money from their child for the cost of raising them, that parent automatically loses their inheritance from Grandma's estate. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything else that had happened that day. I heard a soft sound on the other end of the call, like someone shifting their weight or setting something down on a countertop. When Daniel finally spoke again, his voice carried a sharp edge of disbelief. That does not make any sense. Why would she write something like that? Because she has been watching this family for a long time, I said quietly. I unfolded the document and looked again at the notarized seal near the bottom of the page. The amendment was signed 6 months ago. Daniel exhaled slowly. 6 months ago? Before the reunion? Yes. The line remained quiet for several seconds. I could almost hear the calculations running through his mind the same way I analyze numbers at work. If the amendment was valid, then my mother's invoice had triggered the exact condition my grandmother described. "How much money are we talking about?" Daniel asked finally. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I glanced at the second page of the amendment where the estate value was listed. The estimated value of Grandma's estate right now is a little over $3.2 million, I said. The television in the background suddenly went silent. Someone must have muted it. Daniel spoke again, his voice noticeably quieter now. "Are you telling me Mom could lose her inheritance because of that email she sent you?"
According to the document, yes.
I could hear movement again on the other end of the call, the faint murmur of my parents' voices somewhere nearby. Daniel lowered his voice slightly. "Emily, you cannot seriously be considering using Grandma's estate as leverage against Mom." I leaned back in my chair and looked out through the kitchen window at the streetlights outside. "I am not using anything as leverage, Daniel. I have not even responded to Mom yet. I am just telling you what the document says." He sighed heavily. "You know how Mom is. She was angry after the reunion. She probably did not think through the legal consequences of what she wrote." The words sounded like the same argument he had used our entire lives whenever my mother crossed a line.
Mom did not mean it that way.
Mom was just frustrated. Mom was trying to teach a lesson. But the difference now was that someone else had already written a lesson of their own. "Daniel," I said slowly, "has Mom mentioned anything about Grandma updating her will recently?" "No," he replied immediately. "Grandma never talks about money with us." That did not surprise me. My grandmother had always preferred quiet preparation over dramatic announcements. I folded the document again and placed it back into the envelope. "I am not planning to start a fight with Mom," I continued. "But she asked me to repay $186,000 because she believes raising me was a failed investment. If she wants to treat family like a financial contract, then she should probably understand the financial terms involved." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a tension that had not been there earlier in the call. "Do you have a copy of that amendment?"
Yes.
"Is it notarized?"
Yes.
Another pause followed. I could almost picture Daniel running a hand through his hair the way he did whenever a business negotiation suddenly shifted in an unexpected direction. "Emily," he said finally, "I think you should bring that document to Mom and Dad's house tomorrow so we can all read it together." I looked down at the envelope again. For the first time since my mother sent the invoice that morning, the balance of control in the situation felt completely different. "I think that is a good idea," I said calmly, "because if Mom still wants to talk about repayment plans, she should probably understand exactly what that decision could cost her." The drive from Columbus to my parents' house in Dayton takes a little over 1 hour if traffic is light, and the next afternoon I made the trip with the cream-colored envelope resting on the passenger seat beside me. The sky was clear and the highway was quiet, but the steady rhythm of the road gave me too much time to think about everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. My mother believed she had sent me a message that would force me into a corner, a financial demand meant to remind me that in her mind I had never lived up to the expectations she had invested in. But the document in the envelope represented something entirely different. It represented preparation. My grandmother had seen the pattern long before the reunion, long before the invoice, and she had quietly built a response that did not rely on arguments or emotions. It relied on terms and consequences. When I pulled into the driveway of my parents' house just after 5 in the afternoon, Daniel's car was already parked beside my father's truck. The house looked exactly the way it always had, a 2-story brick place in a quiet suburban neighborhood where the lawns were trimmed neatly and the mailboxes all matched. From the outside, nothing about the place suggested that the next few minutes might completely change the balance of power inside the Carter family. I stepped out of the car, picked up the envelope, and walked to the front door. Daniel opened it before I even had the chance to knock. His expression was tight. The confident calm he usually carried replaced with a kind of cautious focus.
"Come in," he said quietly.
Mom and Dad are in the living room. The familiar smell of my mother's cooking drifted through the house, but the atmosphere felt unusually still. My father sat in his usual chair near the window with his hands folded together, while my mother stood beside the coffee table holding a printed copy of the invoice she had sent me the day before. She did not smile when she saw me. Instead, she gestured toward the sofa, like she was inviting someone to sit down for a business meeting. "Emily," she said in the same controlled tone she used whenever she believed she was being reasonable, "I am glad you decided to come. Daniel told me you wanted to discuss the situation in person." I placed the envelope on the coffee table and sat down slowly. "I think that would be best," I replied. My mother lifted the invoice slightly and tapped the edge of the paper against her palm. "As you can see," she said, "everything is clearly itemized. Your father and I simply want acknowledgement of the financial reality involved in raising a child. That is all this is about. Accountability." My father remained quiet, his eyes moving between the envelope on the table and the printed document in my mother's hand. Daniel stood near the doorway with his arms crossed, watching both of us carefully. I nodded once and leaned forward slightly. "I understand that you believe raising me was a financial investment that did not produce the result you expected," I said calmly. My mother gave a small nod of approval as if she appreciated the phrasing. "Exactly. That is a mature way to look at it. Which is why I brought something you should probably read before we discuss repayment plans." I slid the cream-colored envelope across the coffee table toward her. My mother frowned slightly, clearly not expecting the conversation to move in that direction. "What is this?" she asked. "It is a document Grandma Maggie mailed to me yesterday afternoon," I said. My mother's expression tightened just a little at the mention of my grandmother's name. She opened the envelope and unfolded the pages slowly, her eyes scanning the top of the first sheet. At first her face showed only mild confusion, the way someone looks when they are reading unfamiliar legal language. But as she continued down the page, the expression changed. The small crease between her eyebrows deepened, and the confident posture she had maintained since I walked in began to shift. Daniel stepped closer, trying to read the document over her shoulder. My father leaned forward in his chair for the first time since I arrived. "What is it?" he asked quietly. My mother did not answer immediately. She kept reading, her eyes moving faster now as she reached the section describing the conditional inheritance clause. The room grew so quiet that the ticking wall clock above the television sounded unusually loud. After a long moment, my mother looked up from the page and stared directly at me. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "Grandma Maggie sent it to me," I replied. "Yesterday afternoon." Daniel reached for the second page of the document and read the section listing the estimated value of the estate. $3.2 million, he murmured under his breath. My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Linda, what exactly does that amendment say?" he asked. My mother's voice was tighter now as she answered. "It says that if a parent in this family tries to charge their own child money for raising them, that parent loses their inheritance from Margaret's estate." The sentence hung in the room like a sudden change in air pressure. My mother slowly lowered the pages and looked again at the invoice still in her hand. For the first time since the conversation began, the certainty in her expression was gone. And for 14 long seconds, no one in the Carter family said a single word. For several seconds, no one moved. The only sound in the living room was the quiet ticking of the wall clock and the faint hum of the air conditioner pushing cool air through the vents. My mother continued staring at the document in her hands, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less serious if she read them enough times. Daniel slowly took the second page from her and scanned the paragraphs again, his eyes stopping at the section where my grandmother had outlined the conditional inheritance clause in precise legal language. My father cleared his throat softly from his chair near the window. "Linda," he said carefully, "is that amendment real?" My mother did not answer immediately. She flipped to the last page, where the notarized seal and witness signatures were printed in dark blue ink. The silence stretched long enough that I could see the exact moment when the realization settled in. The document was not a warning. It was already official. Margaret would not do something like this without speaking to a lawyer, Daniel said quietly as he read the notarization date again. 6 months ago. That means she prepared this before the reunion even happened. My mother lowered the papers slowly onto the coffee table beside the invoice she had printed the night before. The contrast between the two documents was impossible to ignore. One was a simple spreadsheet-style invoice created on a home computer. The other was a formal estate amendment signed, witnessed, and notarized by an attorney. For the first time since I arrived, my mother's voice no longer carried the confident certainty she had used earlier. "Why would she write something like this?" she asked, though the question sounded more like she was asking the room rather than any one person in particular. Daniel leaned forward slightly and tapped the paragraph describing the inheritance forfeiture clause. "Because she saw this coming," he said quietly. My father looked from the document to my mother and then toward me, his expression uncertain. "Emily," he said slowly, "did your grandmother say anything else when she sent this to you?" I shook my head. She included a short note. It just said that sometimes people only understand numbers when they appear on official paper. Daniel gave a short breath of disbelief under his breath. "That sounds exactly like Grandma." My mother suddenly picked up the invoice again and held it tightly in her hand. "This does not change the principle of the situation," she said, though her tone now sounded more defensive than confident. "Raising children still costs money. Your father and I sacrificed a lot." I nodded slightly. "I never said you did not." The room fell quiet again, as everyone seemed to calculate the numbers in their heads. $186,000 was the total my mother expected me to repay. But the inheritance listed in my grandmother's estate amendment was worth more than 17 times that amount. My father leaned forward and rubbed his hands together slowly, something he always did when he was trying to think through a complicated situation. "Linda," he said carefully, "maybe we should talk to Margaret before making any decisions." My mother's eyes narrowed slightly. "I am not calling her to ask permission to discuss family finances with my own daughter." Daniel spoke next, his voice measured in the same way he handled tense meetings at work. "Mom, it is not just a discussion anymore. According to this amendment, the moment you try to collect repayment for raising Emily, you could lose your share of the estate." My mother opened her mouth to respond but stopped for a moment, clearly weighing the words she wanted to say. The air in the room felt heavier now, as if the entire conversation had shifted from a simple family disagreement to something far more complicated. Daniel placed the second page of the amendment back on the coffee table and looked directly at my mother. "How serious are you about this invoice?" he asked. My mother hesitated for the first time since the conversation began. "I meant what I said," she replied. "But that does not mean I want to start a legal war inside this family." Daniel nodded slowly. "Because that is exactly what could happen if this clause is triggered." My father looked toward me again, his voice softer now. "Emily, what do you want to happen here?" It was the first time anyone had asked me that question since the invoice arrived. I looked down at both documents on the coffee table, the neat rows of numbers on the invoice beside the formal legal language of my grandmother's amendment. "I do not want anything," I said calmly. "I did not send the invoice. I did not write the estate clause. I just brought the document here, so everyone understands the situation." My mother watched me carefully, her expression difficult to read. "So, what are you suggesting?" she asked. I met her eyes without raising my voice. I am suggesting that if you still believe raising me was a financial investment that failed, then you should continue with your repayment plan. The amendment simply means that decision will have a different cost than you originally expected. Daniel leaned back slowly and looked from my mother to the estate document again. The quiet realization that had started earlier was now fully settled in the room. The invoice had been designed to pressure me into accepting a debt. But now everyone sitting in that living room understood that the real financial decision no longer belonged to me at all. My mother remained standing beside the coffee table with the invoice still in her hand, but the posture she had walked into the room with was gone. A few minutes earlier, she had spoken like someone presenting a logical argument. Now she looked like someone trying to solve a problem that had changed shape halfway through the conversation. Daniel moved slowly toward the armchair across from my father and sat down, his eyes still fixed on the estate amendment lying between the two pieces of paper. My father leaned forward again and adjusted his glasses before reading through the paragraph one more time, as if he was hoping he had misunderstood it the first time. Linda, he said quietly, this clause is very specific. It does not say may lose inheritance. It says will lose inheritance if repayment is pursued. My mother did not respond immediately. She picked up the amendment again and read the line carefully, her lips pressing together as she reached the sentence that connected the behavior described in the clause to the legal consequence that followed. I could see the moment she understood that this was not a matter of interpretation. Margaret Carter had written the language the way someone writes a contract. Daniel finally broke the silence again. Mom, he said carefully, if you move forward with the invoice, Grandma's estate attorney will probably consider it a violation of this amendment. My mother lowered the document slowly and looked at him with visible frustration. That assumes Margaret would actually enforce something like this against her own family. Daniel nodded once. If it is written into the will and notarized, the attorney does not need Grandma to enforce it. It becomes automatic. My father shifted in his chair again, clearly uncomfortable with how quickly the conversation had turned into a financial calculation none of them had expected. Linda, he said, maybe we should step back and think about what matters here. My mother turned toward him sharply. What matters is that Emily understands the principle involved in raising a child who never reached her potential. I watched her say the sentence and noticed something I had not seen before. The conviction was still there, but now it was competing with something else. Uncertainty. Daniel rubbed his forehead slowly and leaned forward with his elbows resting on his knees. Mom, he said, you asked Emily to repay $186,000. If you push that request and the amendment is triggered, you could lose access to more than $1.6 million from Grandma's estate. The room went quiet again as the numbers landed. My father looked down at the coffee table as if the two documents might somehow rearrange themselves into a different outcome. $186,000 on the invoice. More than $3.2 million in the estate. The comparison was impossible to ignore. My mother looked at me again, her voice slower now. Emily, are you planning to use this document to threaten your own parents? I shook my head calmly. I am not threatening anyone. I simply brought the document here because it affects the decision you asked me to make. Daniel nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the point. That is true, he said quietly. The situation changed the moment the amendment became relevant. My mother looked down again at the invoice in her hand. The paper that had seemed so solid the night before now looked strangely small next to the legal document lying beside it. You are telling me that Margaret created this clause specifically to interfere with how I manage my own family? She asked. Daniel answered before I could. She created it to protect how the family treats each other, he said. My father finally spoke again, his voice careful and measured. Linda, we have always known Margaret has strong opinions about fairness. My mother gave a short breath of frustration. Fairness? charging Emily for the cost of raising her as fairness. Daniel leaned back slightly and looked at her with a calm seriousness I had rarely seen from him. Mom, fairness does not usually involve sending your child a bill. The sentence hung in the air longer than anything else that had been said that evening. For the first time since I walked into the house, my mother did not respond immediately. She simply stared at the invoice in her hand. I watched as she slowly placed it back on the coffee table beside the estate amendment. The two pieces of paper lay side by side again, but now the difference between them felt even larger than before. One represented a demand. The other represented a consequence. My father leaned forward and rested his hands on his knees. Linda, he said quietly, maybe the real question is not whether Emily owes us money. Maybe the real question is whether we want to risk losing Margaret's inheritance over this argument. Daniel nodded once in agreement, but he did not look at either of them. Instead, he looked at the invoice again. Mom, he said slowly, if you continue with this, the choice will not belong to Emily anymore. It will belong to the clause Grandma wrote 6 months ago. My mother sat there for several seconds without speaking. When she finally reached forward again, it was not for the amendment. It was for the invoice she had printed the night before. She picked it up, looked at the numbers one more time, and then slowly folded the paper in half. My mother held the folded invoice in both hands for several seconds, without speaking. The room remained completely still except for the soft ticking of the clock above the television. I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the same quiet mental arithmetic that Daniel had already spoken out loud. $186,000, compared to more than $3.2 million in my grandmother's estate. The numbers did not exist in the same universe. My father finally leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding his breath through the entire conversation. Linda, he said carefully, we should think about what Margaret was trying to say with this amendment. My mother looked up sharply. What she was trying to say is that she does not trust me to raise my own family the way I see fit. Daniel shook his head slightly. That is not what the clause says. It says if a parent tries to charge their own child money for being raised, they lose their inheritance. It does not say anything about parenting styles. It is about turning family relationships into financial transactions. My mother looked back down at the folded invoice and ran her thumb slowly across the crease in the paper. For years she had always spoken with certainty about how our family worked, about how expectations and results were supposed to align. But the document on the table had introduced something she could not control. A consequence that had already been written months before she sent the email. My father spoke again, his voice quiet and steady. Linda, Margaret built that estate over 30 years. Those properties represent most of her life's work. If this clause is real, then she clearly feels strongly about it. My mother looked up again, her expression tighter now.
So, what are you suggesting?
That we simply pretend Emily owes us nothing? Daniel answered before my father could. I think what Dad is suggesting is that we consider whether the point of this invoice is worth losing what Grandma intended to leave the family. My mother did not respond right away. She placed the folded invoice back onto the coffee table beside the estate amendment and stared at both documents for a long moment. The room felt different now than when I first walked in. Earlier, the invoice had been the center of the conversation. Now, it looked more like a problem nobody quite knew how to address. Finally, my mother picked up the estate amendment again and read through the key paragraph one more time.
The words had not changed.
The language remained exactly as precise and unmistakable as it had been when I read it in my apartment the day before. She set the document down again and turned toward me. Emily, she said slowly, when Margaret sent you this document, did she ask you to bring it here?
No, y replica calmly.
She only told me to read it carefully before responding to the invoice. My mother studied my face, as if she was searching for something behind the answer. And you decided to bring it anyway. I nodded once. Because the invoice created a situation that the amendment directly addresses. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair and folded his hands together. That is the key point, he said quietly. Mom, the clause does not depend on Emily threatening anything. It activates the moment you attempt to collect repayment. My father nodded slowly, which means the decision is not really about Emily anymore. It is about whether we continue pursuing the invoice at all. The sentence hung in the air with a kind of quiet finality. For several seconds, my mother did not speak. Then she reached forward and picked up the folded invoice once more. The paper looked much smaller now than it had the night before when she printed it and sent the email. She unfolded it slowly and stared at the rows of numbers again. Childcare.
Food.
Clothing. School supplies. A lifetime reduced to a list of expenses. Finally, she looked up again, but this time her voice carried less certainty than before. I only wanted acknowledgement that raising children requires sacrifice, she said. Daniel nodded gently. It does. But sending an invoice is not acknowledgement. It turns a family relationship into a debt contract. My father looked toward my mother again and spoke with unusual firmness. Linda, I think we have to ask ourselves something simple. Is this invoice more important than keeping the family intact? My mother did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked down at the invoice one final time, then slowly placed it back onto the table. Her fingers rested on the edge of the paper for a moment before she lifted it again and tore it cleanly down the center. The sound of the paper splitting echoed louder than expected in the quiet living room. Daniel watched the two halves of the document fall onto the table beside the estate amendment. My father leaned back slightly in his chair, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. My mother looked at the torn pieces for a few seconds and then turned toward me. The anger that had been there earlier was gone, replaced by something more complicated. The invoice is no longer relevant, she said quietly. And for the first time since the email arrived in my inbox, the demand that had started the entire conflict no longer existed. For a few seconds after the sound of the paper tearing faded, no one in the room spoke. The two halves of the invoice lay on the coffee table beside the estate amendment like the remains of a decision that had suddenly lost its power. My mother slowly leaned back against the edge of the couch, her hands resting loosely at her sides. The tension that had filled the room earlier had not completely disappeared, but it had shifted into something quieter and harder to define. Daniel exhaled softly and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees while looking at the torn paper. I did not think the situation would resolve quite like that, he said carefully. My father gave a small nod from his chair near the window. Sometimes numbers make people rethink things faster than arguments do, he replied. My mother did not respond right away. Her eyes moved slowly from the torn invoice to the estate amendment still lying flat on the table. For years she had been the one who controlled the narrative of success in our family. She decided what counted as achievement, what counted as disappointment, and who deserved praise for meeting expectations. But the document my grandmother created had introduced something my mother could not manage with opinion or pressure. It introduced an external rule. Finally, my mother spoke again, her voice quieter than it had been at any point earlier in the conversation. I never intended for this to become a financial standoff inside the family, she said. Daniel looked up at her with a neutral expression. But that is what happens when money becomes the language of the argument. My father shifted slightly in his chair and looked toward me again. Emily, he said slowly, I think it is fair to say we did not handle this situation well. The words sounded simple, but hearing them spoken aloud carried more weight than I expected. My father had spent most of his life avoiding direct conflict inside the family. Acknowledging a mistake in front of everyone was something I had rarely seen him do. My mother looked at him for a moment as if she was deciding whether to challenge the statement, but She said nothing. Daniel leaned back and rested his hands on the arms of the chair. Mom, he said calmly, the truth is that sending the invoice created a problem that did not exist before. Even if the estate amendment had never been written, it would still have been difficult to justify. My mother watched the torn pieces of paper for a long moment before finally speaking again. I only wanted Emily to understand that life requires accountability, she said quietly. I met her gaze without raising my voice. Accountability usually means being responsible for your own choices, I replied. It does not usually mean paying someone back for the fact that you were born. The room fell quiet again, but this time the silence did not feel tense. It felt reflective. My father looked at the estate amendment one more time and then pushed the document gently toward me across the table. You should probably keep that with you, he said. If Margaret wanted you to have it, she likely expected you to decide what to do with it. I nodded and carefully placed the pages back inside the cream-colored envelope. Daniel stood up and walked slowly toward the kitchen doorway, pausing for a moment before turning back toward the living room. You know, he said thoughtfully, Grandma always had a way of teaching lessons without actually raising her voice. My mother gave a small breath that might have been the beginning of a reluctant smile. That sounds like something Margaret would do. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then my father stood up from his chair and stretched slightly as if the conversation had finally reached its natural end. Well, he said, I think we can all agree that the financial discussion has officially ended. Daniel nodded, once in agreement. Definitely ended. My mother looked toward me again, and although the expression on her face was still complicated, the sharp certainty that had driven the invoice no longer appeared there. Emily, she said slowly, the document you brought today has made something very clear. I waited quietly for her to continue. She glanced briefly at the envelope in my hands before finishing the thought. Some things in life cannot be measured as investments or returns. The sentence might not have been a full apology, but it was closer than anything I had heard from her in years. Daniel checked the time on his phone and gave a short nod toward the front door. I should probably head back soon. I have an early meeting tomorrow. My father walked with him toward the hallway while my mother remained seated for a moment longer. Then she stood up and gathered the 2 torn pieces of the invoice from the table. She looked at them once more before dropping them into the small wastebasket beside the couch. The paper disappeared into the bin without another sound. As I stood and picked up my keys, I realized something about the situation that had not been obvious the day before. The invoice had been meant to define me as a failed investment. But in the end, the only document that truly carried weight in that room was the one my grandmother had quietly prepared months earlier. And that document had done something no argument ever could. It forced everyone in the Carter family to reconsider the cost of the words they chose to use. The sky was already turning darker by the time I stepped out of my parents' house that evening, the quiet suburban street lit by a row of yellow porch lights and the soft glow from living room windows along the block. I walked down the driveway slowly, the cream-colored envelope still in my hand, and for the first time since the strange email had appeared in my inbox the day before, the weight of everything that had happened finally settled into something clear and calm. The conversation inside the house had not been dramatic. There had been no shouting, no slammed doors, no speeches meant to win an argument. Instead, the entire situation had shifted because of a simple realization that arrived quietly and stayed. When I reached my car, I placed the envelope on the passenger seat again, exactly where it had been during the drive earlier that afternoon. The difference now was that the envelope no longer felt like a piece of leverage in a family dispute. It felt more like a reminder of how carefully my grandmother had understood the dynamics of our family long before anyone else acknowledged them out loud. I started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, watching the house grow smaller in the rearview mirror as I turned onto the main road. For years, that house had been the place where expectations were explained, where success was defined, and where I had often felt like the quiet comparison next to my brother's achievements. But tonight something subtle had changed inside those walls. Not because I argued harder or spoke louder. The change happened because someone else had already written a rule about what family should and should not become. The drive back to Columbus felt shorter than the trip earlier in the day. My mind kept returning to the same moment again and again, the quiet sound of paper tearing in the living room when my mother finally split the invoice in half. It had not been dramatic. It had not been symbolic in the way movies sometimes portray turning points. But it had ended the one idea that started the entire conflict. The idea that my life could be reduced to a balance sheet. When I reached my apartment building a little after 7:30, the parking lot was half full, and the evening air carried the faint smell of rain from somewhere far off in the distance. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment before picking up the envelope again. The estate amendment was still inside exactly as my grandmother had mailed it, the notarized seal pressed into the corner of the final page. I thought about the way Daniel had described her earlier in the evening, someone who taught lessons without raising her voice. That description felt even more accurate now. My grandmother had not confronted my mother at the reunion. She had not argued about fairness or expectations or family loyalty. Instead, she had created a system that quietly connected behavior to consequences. A rule that did not depend on emotion, persuasion, or negotiation. Just numbers and decisions. When I finally walked upstairs and unlocked the door to my apartment, the quiet inside felt comforting after the long conversation at my parents' house. I placed the envelope carefully in the small desk drawer beside my laptop, the same place I usually kept important documents like tax forms and work contracts. For a moment, I considered calling my grandmother to tell her everything that had happened, but then I remembered the note she had written at the bottom of her letter. Sometimes people only understand numbers when they appear on official paper. She had already known how the situation would unfold. I poured a glass of water from the kitchen sink and stood by the window looking out at the quiet street below. Cars passed occasionally, headlights sliding across the pavement before disappearing again. Life outside my family continued exactly the same as it had the day before. But something inside me had shifted in a way that felt difficult to explain. For most of my life, I had believed the role my parents assigned to me, the quiet daughter who never quite became the success they imagined. Hearing my mother describe my life as a failed investment had hurt more than I expected, not because of the money, but because of the idea behind it. The suggestion that love could be calculated like a return on a financial decision. Yet the document my grandmother created had done something unexpected. It did not prove that I was successful or unsuccessful. It did not compare me to my brother or redefine the expectations my parents carried for years. Instead, it changed the conversation entirely. It established one simple boundary. A child is not a financial liability, and family is not a contract where affection must produce measurable returns. Later that night, just before I turned off the lights in my apartment, my phone buzzed with a short message from Daniel. It contained only one sentence. Grandma always did understand how our family works. I read the message once, and then set the phone down on the nightstand beside my bed. The events of the last 2 days had started with an invoice that tried to assign a price to my existence. But in the end, the only number that mattered was the one my grandmother had quietly attached to a different idea entirely. The cost of treating your own family like an investment.